Hello and welcome back to Startups, People and Equity. This is a space where we discuss topics, related to startups, people and equity. We hope that you will enjoy listening to today's episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. Let's dive straight in. I'm very happy to introduce Sara as our guest for today's episode. She's deeply embedded into the HR and people space and has seen it all. She's been doing this for more than 7 years, working with startups, working with larger companies, and she's been part of not one, not two, but 3 startups from early stage to Series B+. She's also an entrepreneur. She started her own company, and she also operates as a consultant and advisor in the DEI, comp, progression, recruiting, engagement, well-being. So you can see she's extremely knowledgeable and experienced. And personally for me, that meant that she was able to advise the team and me personally in people and recruiting situations when I needed it the most. So I'm very happy to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. So kind. Such a kind intro. Thank you, Spela, and thank you, Tamas, for having me.
Yeah, thanks for giving us a bit of your time. Yeah, it was a great intro, Spela. You put the bar very high on the first one in 2023.
It's all Sara. Yeah, but I want to go straight into the topic because there's one looming question we had for the intro, which is why being a consultant?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one I've got a few times. And so, fun fact: I started my career as a consultant in recruiting, and almost crossed my 8 years from starting as a consultant in recruiting in an agency, and I really enjoyed part of that work where I could get to meet and experience many different companies and cultures, and their needs and what made them successful. And while I've then gone through obviously being a people leader in a few companies and working across a number of topics within that company, I still love the kind of the detective work that is around being a consultant. So I see it as working in a company, your work expands horizontally, and you have many topics to look at, and kind of you're able to keep an eye on a lot of things at the same time, which is incredibly fascinating. Whilst when you're a consultant, then your work really expands vertically. So you're brought in to work on 1-2 different issues or projects, and you really go in depth for everything that surrounds these topics. So from the needs analysis, design, development, implementation. It is a very in-depth work that I really enjoy, and also couples well with my strengths. So somehow I see it as like a full circle, experience a little bit of everything, and going back to something that I really enjoyed. And also I see it as a very good fit for what I bring to companies as well.
Would love to pick up on one thing you said in there, Sarah, which is like going deep. And I understand that you led the people teams, and Phila introduced you in these 3 different startups. So do you enjoy like leading teams, or so are you more of a people manager or individual contributor? How do you see yourself?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, I would say, because I do enjoy both of them, and I think they're very different as well. I think what we have in a lot of startups, you tend to be both. So you do people management, you do project work, you work also as an IC, of course, for the needs of a company that is going through growth phases. And if I look at kind of what I enjoyed the most at times is still leading and influencing, but also not necessarily in a formal structure type of way. So still being the glue that holds together a project team, but not necessarily formally managing a team as well. Although that is also something that I did enjoy, and that gave me a lot of insights and a lot of really positive experiences.
It got me thinking to the word horizontal that you used in your first answer. And I think it's, you say horizontal and vertical as two separate things, but working with you, I've seen that you were able to actually do both. So now when I think of you, I think of someone that knows how to do career progression, because you've done it in 3 companies. You've seen the pitfalls, you've seen the benefits of certain frameworks or a self-created framework. And there's also the other topics like that I mentioned in the intro. But I would like to stick to the first one, the career progression first, because from these horizontal perspective and being an expert in all the vertical ones, you can lay them one next to another through all of these startups. And it would be very interesting for us to hear what are the differences between all of these 3 once you look at them like that. Like the 3 startups from early stage to Series B, what can you put together? What are the differences?
So the 3 companies I worked with, I think they were very similar in some aspects and very, very different in others. So even though all of them SaaS companies, mainly tech focused, software focused, so the composition of the team was not wildly different, but each of them had very unique traits. So obviously every company has the shared set of beliefs, norms, the culture that makes it. And in a startup, especially in an early stage, a lot of it is also connected with the founders themselves or the founding team, so the initial team in a company. And I think to that, it can create possibly an infinite number of different companies, right? Because you'll never have the same set of individuals, or occasionally probably, but most likely you don't have the same set of individuals. And much of the initial work that I've done in the people and talent aspects was similar. So bringing structure in, creating processes, creating practices, understanding the behaviors. But the way that work was implemented in each company was indeed different. So in practice, you can do similar things, but in a very different way. So you need to never skip that initial phase where you really gather the insights about the company. So that's what I would call the first need analysis that you do when you enter a company, and it's very outlined in a consultant work. It's not as outlined when you actually go in a company, but it's such a crucial moment because you're only going to be joining once, right? You're only going to be once the one that can truly observe from, so to say, the outside and really see before you're really into it. You can see the differences very clearly. So I think once you understand that part of behaviors, values, beliefs, then you can go on to implementing similar structures, processes, and so on in the way that is true to the company. So that is how you also can ensure that you have more buy-in, more effectiveness of what you do. And I said career progression, for example, very different approaches in the 3 different startups, but in its own way also effective to that company, because that was kind of like what was required for the team and the stage and the culture that was making the company.
Would you say that these, when I say early stage to Series B, Are the stats the same for all three? Or do we did the definition of early stage and Series B plus change from when you started with the first startup and now to this one?
In general, I've worked in different size of companies and different phase of growth as well, even though the founding round is how we define it then more broadly. But definitely the maturity curve also of a company can vary, even if it's at the same or similar stage. And obviously you have more formal benchmarks as well that can help you with identifying when a company is ready for a funding round and when it goes through the various stages. But broadly, it can be very different what it means to be a seed startup or growth phase startup.
If you were to be looking at a startup from the outside and all you knew that was it's a Series A company, mm-hmm. What else would you need to look at to know, what phase of frameworks to apply to it?
Many things. So I would say one of the initial questions that I have is whether there are formalized processes in a company. And the formalized processes can be anywhere around your entire operations or specifically for people and talent. And that already tells you a lot, not just about where the company is, but about your stakeholders as well. So there is one aspect of implementing new structures that it's deeply intertwined, which is your company readiness to change, right? And whether you've already gone through some steps and you have some processes or not at all, and you're more kind of like organically doing everything around running a business, then that will set you up for further investigation, right? Then if there are formal structures, then you want to understand what are those? Are they based on a company culture already, the vision, mission, values, or are they based on some best practices that, you can find many of them out there. But even in the case where there are no explicit structures, you might want to look at what implicitly is there, because you might not have a system to put your holidays, but you might have a shared understanding that the way you put your holidays in the calendar is set in a predetermined way. And you want to resist from making assumptions, right? You want to base your understanding on really the observations.
That's fantastic. I would like to get into progression in just a second, but before we do that, I'm super curious. You've mentioned a little bit how at early stage the culture and the shared myths are shaped by the founding team and the founders specifically. Throughout these three journeys, to what extent have you felt empowered to change certain elements of this culture?
I think the approach of the founding team was different in every case, and I would maybe look at the level of understanding and whether that as well was explicit or implicit. There are also kind of unwritten norms and behaviors and thoughts around people and talent. And one of the things that I found useful was to have a written understanding of kind of like what were the core aspects of the company that we didn't want to change, and we thought the company really relied on them for its success and its growth, and what were the things that either we seek to change, so we recognize that right now are not working, or we're flexible about. So I think you need to work within this kind of realm of understanding, and there is a line of kind of not overstepping into changing who the company is, because that's not what you want to do, and that could get you a lot of resistance to change and then endanger the next steps that you want to take. So you want to take maybe smaller steps unless you're tasked to change something bigger in the beginning. But really, the understanding what the company is relying on at the time you come in is important. And once you've set that understanding and that behavior, then you create your own flexibility. You create your own empowerment into knowing what aspects can be changed and to what extent. So that, you give a little bit or a lot of yourself, and you also really get in sync with the company, right? Your beliefs and the company's beliefs, which is really what a cultural ad would be, is they get intertwined, and then you can work with that. And with that, I have to say, in each company, there were things that were easier to change or more difficult to change, but all with a very good understanding of the reasoning why something was more protected and maybe not as easy to change over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really liked how you kind of made yourself an actor in the empowerment, because usually we think of empowerment as something that happens to us by someone else. You kind of just highlighted how you can create that for yourself. And I guess the interview process is also an important part, because if the gap between you and the founding team is too big, then probably it's too difficult to create that empowerment.
Definitely. You're going to suffer on both sides if that is the case, right? You can feel endangered as a founder, and you can feel limited as a leader. So definitely you want to make sure that you have a very transparent two-way interview process in this type of roles, hopefully in all type of roles, but definitely this is an important one to have.
Yeah, I also think so. Amazing. If you agree, then I would love to dive into progression. How have you done it? What have worked? What is the good, the bad, the ugly? Spill it out for us, please.
Of course. So as I said, 3 different ways to do career progressions in the 3 experiences that I've had. But there's many ways to do career progression. From my experience, what I've really looked at in kind of the 3 different ways was a more qualitative or quantitative, or a mix of the two, where we relied, for example, on really numbers to kind of rank the behaviors, the performance, or really just the type of behaviors, the qualitative aspect of it, or a mix between the two. For the 3 different companies, it worked in its own kind of environment as well. But also between these 3, you could find more facets of it, like you could find more dimensions. So do you go for a 180 degree or a 360 degree or a one-way performance review? So there's really, really many ways, and there's many best practices. So what really kind of shaped the decision was based on the need of a company, and on also what kind of thoughts and behaviors they wanted to strengthen and highlight. Because, I mean, career progression is a tool that is incredibly useful in terms of engagement and development of your team, but it's also a tool that works very well to shape a company as it grows, right? It doesn't start and end in the 1 week to 1 month period around these evaluations, but it really can be an everyday exercise around what I would like to see to ensure that the company is successful as well.
It's a topic very close to probably all employees and of all companies, and so that also means for myself. So this is a personal experience that I've had. It's a very difficult time for both sides, for the managers and for the employees. And I think, of course, both sides sometimes forget that it's difficult for the other side. But why do you think it's difficult?
Many reasons. And also, it depends. The answer that you get a lot, but so one of the key reasons that that this is actually it was really labeled as awkward by one of the HR societies that I read, and it was labeled as awkward by some of the biggest companies really that there are. Because in these specific cases, or when it doesn't feel not easy, I want to say, but possible, is when you don't have an associated change of behavior once you introduce a career progression process. So assuming that you are in a company that does annual or biannual reviews, and the training around really feedback and progression and goal setting is not on par with what you're trying to achieve, then you might potentially find two parties, in this case, manager and employee, or more, of course, your people team, your leadership team, that doesn't really know how to behave around this when you're not in the review process. So it then becomes, or can become, some sort of black box, right? And then you have this surprise party in after review, where you will know if from your manager, basically, if you get a raise, a promotion, a change of responsibility, or so on, but you don't have enough context on it, or in all the time leading up to this conversation. And that can obviously make things very awkward. Imagine if you get in a conversation and you're told that the project that you worked on 3 months ago was not up to standard, but you didn't know back then and you couldn't work on it. And then for 3 months, you kind of built on that strength, but that was actually not it. And that can be very detrimental to the conversation. It can possibly shut down the conversation, right? Because then you take away the trust in this relationship, and you won't have the same openness to really kind of get off on the right foot for the next period to come. So I totally understand. I think the key is not in the best process out there, best framework, best whatever, but the key is in the behaviors of the people, in the training, in making people feel comfortable, aware of cultural differences, personality differences, perception differences. And a lot of this training needs to happen as well, so that we're at least aware that there are differences, even though we don't know how to act in each and every situation, but we know how to be truthful, and we know how to have an open conversation. And that hopefully makes things a little bit less awkward, and even more, hopefully, it moves us towards a more continuous conversation as well, and not a one stop in time.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with this last point. I think it's a very leading process, because most often it says biannually or annually, this is the date, this is when we're going to discuss it, and that's the pivotal point. And that kind of leads us as humans into believing that, yes, it only happens twice a year. But in reality, it happens every day, and hopefully every 2 weeks, once a month with the manager. When I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, this is not a static point, it's a flow, it's every day, it's a conversation between you and the manager. The manager ideally knows what would benefit you in the next step in the career progression. And then when I end at this thought point, I see that we're kind of stepping left and right, a bit of the border between shaping humans and shaping workers. And so it's a very dangerous line to be on. So you're either telling someone, Anspela, I like how this certain job is performed like this, so that means that in my book, you're going to go to level 7.2. But in reality, it's a human. And you're also telling a human that this is something that's good or bad. So this is more of a philosophical one, but how to approach this that it remains with some borders, yet allows people to go up in ranking. Yeah, is it?
Yeah. It is a difficult question indeed, and I mean, we could also say, what is the border between objectivity and subjectivity in reviews? And we do so much to make sure that everything is completely objective and data and so on. But in reality, it has a part of subjectivity, and a small part of subjectivity in it. It's not going to break your process, because you can be aware of the person that you're talking to as well, and you should be aware of also the several aspects of the work that surrounds the person. So, if we talk about just responsibilities, even if you say like, okay, for me as a manager, this is what I want to see, or this is the project I want you to complete to go to the next level, and I want you to complete it in this way. But what about somebody who does that and complete it in that way, but meanwhile is not somebody who can build relationships with others in the organization? It's somebody who's, doesn't do a complete ethical practice. So that there are subjectivity aspects which don't necessarily need to be biased, but they can still kind of fit into the conversation, and you want to have those dimensions as well. Of course, if we talk about the job per se, then you could say that kind of what I see as progression is what is written in your own framework, and you could relate to it, and you could have systems that formally ensure that this is fair and equitable across your company, right? You could, for example, have this set of ideal behaviors or competencies that for you as a managers are important, reviewed within your people team, your leadership team, making sure that these are comparable to the same manager expectations in another department. But obviously, at the same time, there are aspects of really quality of work that you might be able to see for your own team that another person, as close as you as they can be, could not see, or maybe things you cannot see that someone else can see. And I think that should still not be ignored.
I have a bit of a hard time with authority, but I love good leaders. It's not about me, but I just wanted to preface what I'm going to say with that, is that I think we should say goodbye to the notion of objectivity. Like, I don't think, to me, it's almost synonymous to a God, that if you believe in it or not. Because as humans, I think the best we can achieve is like this intersubjective, shared, created reality. But it's going to be very different, and the progression process. We should just make peace with the fact that different managers are going to use the same framework slightly differently. And I understand that in the tech companies that we've had experience with, either as clients or working at, it's very difficult for natural science people to understand that in social sciences there isn't something definite. Like, we can't measure it with it can't be put into a metric system. Yeah, so that's a bit of a rumble from my side. But I did have a question as well, which was, you mentioned how you can lift some pressure off the process by having a continuous dialogue. And the other thing I was thinking about, maybe you can lift also some pressure by paying at or above, the 75th percentile. Because I feel like sometimes there are two things people try to achieve through progression. One is acquiring status, and the other is acquiring more pay. How have you seen this two motives play out?
It's a difficult conversation to pair kind of performance and progression and pay very closely. And the compensation part, or the compensation piece, I mean, in also the different companies that I worked with, compensation philosophy was different. and some of them did go for higher percentiles, some didn't. Some went very differently from each kind of team or role or department, to ensure that they could be competitive in that way. That is one part. You want to make sure that people are paid fairly for what they do in a company, for what they bring in a company. But at the same time, it's very hard to set a percentile and choose the same for everyone. And you could also find different justifications to different percentiles. What you need to be aware of is where you're positioned also as an employer. And I think with the good and the bad from everything that comes with it, as long as you're aware and you're reasoning in your decisions as well. Compensation is going to be one aspect that definitely influences status, of course, but at the same time, it's important to use both of these in a way that is true to the company, and with some subjectivity that comes with it as well, that is true to the needs of the company. So you find companies that are expanding quickly, and they are more aggressive in their decisions. And some companies that are more conservative because they don't have as much need, because the work is not as stressful to a certain extent, or it can have more balance. So it is as part, I would say, as the many kind of tools and aspects of people, it can be something that you use instrumentally to achieve kind of your specific company needs. And I've also had some difficulties with finding the right percentiles, for example, because compensation can be very hard to track across geographies. For example, in such a fragmented market like Europe, right? Like you have more reliable instruments for the US, but Europe can be also hard sometimes to just rely on percentiles.
You started a very interesting and a new topic with the comp. I think you can ask any employee and they're gonna complain about their compensation no matter what. I've never met a person that said, you know what, yes, that's exactly what I've always wanted. No matter how high it is. It's interesting because it seems that high compensation opens higher compensation, and then that's what people seek out. In compensation, you just mentioned different geographies, different ways of setting up the compensation philosophy. It's a two-part question. First, who should get to decide the compensation, and then how do you even go about it? Because if you have 7 million tools available and you say 75th percentile here, that might be 50th in the other. What do you do?
The first part is maybe something where I have a more defined idea, the kind of like the decision around compensation. So I think that is the compensation philosophy is a process that can be started and led from your people leaders, but needs to lead into an agreement at your potentially your C-level, your founders, your executive team, your management team, whatever it is in the company. It needs to have that full leadership buy-in. And at the very least, your people leader, your CEO, your CFO, these three aspects at the very least should be aligned. And once you have a compensation philosophy that you can put in writing, and you fairly on the same page about this, then you can apply these principles to individual decisions. Because what you don't want to do is kind of leave that alignment open, and then every single comp decision is going to test you and test whether you have an alignment, or you can get the buy-in, or you can be convincing enough. And that can be a very difficult, daunting process to go through. But let's say that is done. Let's say that we have a comp philosophy, and now that says where we want to be vis-a-vis the market. That says if we want to pay, a leading compensation above the 50, or a lagging one, or on pair. Then where do you go from that? Personally, I've found that there's a couple of approaches that might work. At the very first or onset, where you don't have a lot of data as well from recruiting, for example, you don't know the market very well, then you might want to rely just on whatever system that you use that has just the most data on the geographies that you're working with. Once that is to a certain point where it works, you could also go one step further, which is having some second type of confirmation, which can be in different ways. So one way that I learned from when I was a recruiting consultant was to really use recruiting agencies as well. So they will hire in the market. They will know kind of what the market is like. I wouldn't use that as your first and leading indicator, because there can be a potential conflict of interest, of course. But you can use it to confirm if you have a wide gap into kind of the salaries that you're looking at and the salary that are required in the market, then you know that potentially there's something not working. And once the process is more up and running and you have recruiting data as well, then you can introduce those as well. And this not by asking candidate expectations, and I want to be very explicit about that, because I don't think that's good practice. But by whenever you interview somebody, what I would do normally is just share kind of like the budget that we've thought about for the role, and just ask, is that kind of where you're looking for? And most people, if they say, no, actually it's not, they will also volunteer you where they are looking at. So you will have that data if you are below the market. Some people will also tell you, no, actually, I'm looking lower than that, and you should just discard that because that's not good information for you. But, if you know that you've worked through your compensation in a way that you have reliable budgets, you can still confirm them further, and with the help of your recruiting efforts.
You started a very interesting notion with what you said when you said, okay, this is the first thing you do, you rely on external sources, and then you're moving internally and you combine both of them. It lies very close to, in my mind, to what you said when we were chatting previously, when you said, okay, there's best practice and then there's your practice. Now, what is that? Like, what do you do? Is that the process that you just described, or is there something more to your practice?
Yeah, I believe that is one application of best practice versus your practice. So my main thinking around it is, in people and in talent, you can find a lot of best practices. You can find a lot of examples of very successful procedures and policies or structures. And these are all really good sources of information. So the main thought is best practices are incredibly useful, but you shouldn't rely on this one-to-one for your company, right? Like it not necessarily because a very successful company does something, this is going to be exactly the best for your company. And for me, it's something that really spans across all of the people, all of the talent topics. You can you should be informed. You should know what has worked and what hasn't. But that shouldn't be where your analysis, where your process stops. It shouldn't go from informing to implementation. It should go from informing to understanding what works in your company to designing the process for yourself.
Yeah, and that absolutely makes sense. I really want to go further down in the rabbit hole of compensation. Now we're in it. We're kind of like knee deep, and I want to go like neck deep. But so maybe we can take like benefits and equity off the shelf as well. Yeah, how do you view these topics? Can you just share like your immediate thoughts when I mention these two concepts?
What I would normally define total rewards, right? Like everything that can be considered a reward for the company. And of course, I feel very strongly about equity. That is something that I definitely believe that in especially startup is an important piece of compensation, and is strongly related to the engagement of your company as well. And for what concerns kind of the benefits side, I have to say I have many nuggets of knowledge and thinking processes around benefits. I find there are a couple of trends in the market. You see that specifically the last couple of years, where there was a lot of growth for a lot of companies, for a lot of startups. You might have seen that the number and range of benefits that were offered was growing a lot, right? Because it was the kind of way to differentiate and attract. If you could have the longest benefits page on your website, then you'd be the attractive employer. And don't get me wrong, that is a very good reward strategy. And at the same time, I really believe that if you have benefits, you should regularly assess whether people are using the benefits. Because having benefits that are not used takes time, effort, and doesn't deliver what you want. So benefits really should be based on your company, your culture, the culture of everyone who is in your company, because you'll find very different belief about what should a company do for you, depending on where a person is coming from, or what kind of background they have, or where they've worked before. And I think it's good to be thoughtful about the kind of benefits you want to implement, and make sure that these are real benefits, that they are maximized, and that they have an impact, that actually they are seen as something the company is doing for me, and not just to put it on a long list on a website.
You have a much better perspective than other people professionals I've spoken with. In my mind, it might be a reason that's helping here, because I've seen the US and I've seen Europe. And in Europe, we have so much already provided to us just by being employed, that some of these things that are here law are in the US a benefit. So if you look at healthcare, that is a benefit in the US. Every company has it there. And why I said that I think you may have a different, better view of it, is because you worked with a SF-based company. So comparing benefits lists and comparing the thought process behind what benefits are is different wherever you're headquartered. So
Definitely.
What would you say for European countries? What is an attractive and a needed benefit currently?
To not forget, you just made me think, like when I worked with the San Francisco-based company, one of the challenges was also how do you differentiate the two sets of benefits that you have, US-based and Europe-based. As you say, if you say health insurance, this is only going to be a limited effect in Europe. Of course, you still have private health insurances in many countries, but maybe not as effective. And in terms of what works for Europe, we're still a very fragmented land in Europe. So very different depending on where your team is located. And you see with more and more distributed teams, that is definitely more and more of a challenge that comes up. And even if you look at companies that are aware of kind of the entire life cycle of a person, of an employee, they will look towards having benefits that can make for a better balance of their work and life. They will look at different phases of life of a person. So something that has been a very discussed topic was around the parental leaves in different countries. And even that, you need to consider how differently countries look at parental leaves. You have probably one of the lowest allowance from a state is probably in Switzerland. Even there's not a lot of time that is given to specifically mostly mothers and childbirthing parents, and not as much to the person who's not birthing. But in Scandinavian countries, then you'll find that these benefits are very, very different. So you want to make sure that you either have a one policy that is aligned with all of these geographies, or you need to understand why and how you would differentiate as well. Some of the most common and type of benefits that you can have in every country are around mental health. This is something that no countries so far has developed very advanced policies for it. So mental health days, or having support on this, and specifically these are can be important and useful for startups as well, because they can be environments where you have more responsibilities and maybe a more blurred line between your work and your life. So it can have a bigger impact, not to take away that bigger companies and so can benefit from the same type of benefits, of course.
I wanted to kind of bring this total reward, as you call it, to an overarching picture, because when you were speaking, especially at first, you kind of hinted at the fact that the different elements of total reward trigger different emotional response, or like they target different parts of a human, I would say, somewhat. And the metaphor that came to my mind, and I'm curious what you think of it. I've never been to a basketball game, but unless like seeing The Last Dance twice counts as it. But maybe salary is like buying a ticket to the game, and then the benefits are the popcorn and the soda and whatever else you buy to increase your well-being, so that you will really enjoy your time at the game. And then equity is like being able to shake the hand of Michael Jordan at the end of it, or something like this. What do you think of that?
Yeah, or you could see equity as, if you are part of the team and the team wins, then you get a reward yourself by the work that you've put into it. But definitely there is this like baseline, which is the salary, and having equitable, fair salary policies, and then on top of it you kind of build whatever can make the game enjoyable to your team, basically. So you can use that metaphor for sure to understand how are they gonna come back for the next game? Like, are they still gonna be here over time? And the fact that they will want to bring people in because they think that is a great experience. So there's many aspects of it that to not forget that you don't just do this because you're a good person or you're generous, of course, but at the same time that impacts your engagement. That engagement has direct impact on productivity, on your customer experience as well, on your stakeholder experience, and ultimately on the bottom line of a company and on the success overall of a company. So there is many studies that show kind of the impact of different kind of rewards and reward systems to engagement, to productivity, to well-being, and they are very different based on the company you also work in.
Are you noticing a change in how people react to equity offers? Do they expect equity more than, I don't know, when you first started in recruiting?
If I link this back to really when I started, then I would say the awareness has changed. Not as much as the understanding of equity yet, but if I think back of recruiting for startups in the beginning of my career, I had very rarely the question from someone of how much equity am I getting with this offer, and I very rarely had the offer from the company that openly disclosed, okay, this is the equity. Sometimes there was a piece that said equity, but it wasn't something that was as openly discussed. And definitely what I'm seeing right now, and it might be also a little bit the industry, of course, that I've worked with more in the past couple of years, but the awareness is more there, and the questions from candidates about future employees, about the company itself, to understand not just what you're giving me today as equity, what I'm able to get, but to make my own understanding and assumptions of where is this going to get. So there is more understanding that 1% equity at a seed startup is very different than a Series D, E company, right? And people are making their own research more and are less worried as well of asking, which I see it as a very good development. I personally am a big fan of interview processes where candidates ask a lot of questions and they want to make sure that you're really kind of the right company and that they really want to buy into what you're doing and where you're going. I think that's something as a very, very positive development of the entire industry and process.
That's probably a perfect time to stop for today, but we will come back for part 2 because we've had diversity and inclusion and also engagement and well-being practice topics that we didn't have time for today. So let's see when we find the time, but that will be, if it will be half as much fun to talk about those than it was today, then it will also be amazing. So thanks so much for your time, Sara.
Thank you for the super interesting conversation. Really some good topics there.
Yeah, special thanks for sticking with my metaphors. I know I can be annoying.
Very on point.
So
very on point.
Yeah. they're always like, you start off and I don't know where you're going, and then you end and I'm like, yes. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining. It really was a pleasure, and I'm glad that more people will get to hear your insights and experience.
Thank you so much for having me.